Pastor Michael Todd just shook the entire church world with one bold claim, and he pointed his finger directly at Bishop T.D. Jakes. You won't believe how quickly this controversy spread, because behind the glowing sermons, best-selling books, and global influence, there were whispers of something very different. Let me tell you, people had always respected T.D. Jakes as one of the biggest names in modern Christianity, but when Michael Todd started dropping his words, it felt like he was pulling back the curtain on a legacy many thought was untouchable. This is how things started spiraling into one of the most talked about church controversies of recent times. On the surface, everything looked calm, but the moment Todd's words went viral, the storm began. Bishop T.D. Jakes had been known for decades as the blueprint of a megachurch leader. His name was attached to books, movies, conferences, and even Hollywood connections. For many, he wasn't just a pastor, he was a cultural figure who represented power and success. But here is the shocking part. While some people admired his ability to build an empire, others quietly wondered if the empire had become bigger than the message. That was exactly the question Michael Todd seemed to raise, though he never called out names directly. Still, the way he spoke made it clear in the minds of many that he was aiming at T.D. Jakes. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Michael Todd was not just another young pastor. He came up fast, almost too fast, with a style that broke the usual church mold. His energy, his creativity, and his ability to connect with younger people made him a viral sensation. He wasn't just preaching, he was trending. But the craziest part was that even though Todd had once looked up to Bishop Jakes, his words now sounded like a direct challenge. He said pastors cared more about their empires than God's kingdom. And his choice of words, empire and legacy, felt too specific to be coincidence. People immediately started connecting the dots, and all signs pointed to Bishop Jakes. What made this story different was the timing. T.D. Jakes had been slowly passing more responsibility to his daughter, Sarah Jakes Roberts, building a family legacy that looked like it would dominate for years to come. And here came Michael Todd with his fiery energy, saying the church needed to get back to basics, not building legacies or chasing fame. To many, this looked less like a random critique and more like a carefully timed strike. Destiny took an unexpected turn when the old guard and the new wave seemed to collide right in front of everyone's eyes. By now, it was clear that Michael Todd's words had stirred up a conflict far bigger than anyone expected, and this was only the beginning. When Michael Todd's sermon clips spread across social media, the reaction was immediate and explosive. People started flooding the comments saying he's talking about T.D. Jakes, even though Todd never mentioned his name. Let me tell you, the internet didn't need names. Everyone already knew where the arrows were pointed. This is how the conversation went from a simple Sunday message to a nationwide debate. Some viewers praised Todd for being bold, while others said he was crossing a dangerous line. But here is the shocking part. The words Todd used, empire and legacy, were the exact words many critics had used for years when talking about Bishop Jakes. That connection made the controversy too strong to ignore. Bishop T.D. Jakes had built his ministry into something massive, almost like a corporation. He was respected, but his reach stretched far beyond the pulpit. His church drew tens of thousands, his conferences brought in millions, and his name was connected to Hollywood productions, politicians, and even billion-dollar partnerships. To many, he was a role model for what modern ministry could look like. But critics whispered that the church sometimes looked more like a stage and sermons more like a show. And when Michael Todd said pastors cared more about their own platforms than about disciples, people believed he was finally saying out loud what many had only dared to think quietly. This is where it gets interesting, because Todd was positioning himself as the fearless voice willing to challenge the system. The craziest part was how quickly the story split people into sides. On one hand, there were loyal followers of T.D. Jakes who said Todd was disrespectful and ungrateful. They argued that without pioneers like Jakes, younger pastors like Todd wouldn't even have a platform. On the other side, Todd's supporters said he was telling the truth, pointing out that churches had become too commercial, too polished, and too focused on money. For them, Todd's words were refreshing, a wake-up call that church leaders needed to go back to the basics of faith. What made the story different was that the divide wasn't just about theology, it was about generations. Older believers leaned toward Bishop Jakes, while younger audiences felt more connected to Michael Todd's raw and relatable style. But here's the shocking part. Insiders whispered that this wasn't just about theology at all. It wasn't just about sermons or legacies. It was also about influence and money. Behind the scenes, Michael Todd's church had quickly risen to bring in tens of millions, while Jakes' empire was worth far more with books, films, and conferences. This wasn't just a disagreement, it was competition. Destiny took an unexpected turn when Todd's critique started looking like a power move, a way to claim space in a world Jakes had dominated for decades. And as more people started noticing, the question grew louder. Was Michael Todd simply speaking the truth, or was he trying to shift the balance of power in the megachurch world? When the tension between Michael Todd and Bishop T.D. Jakes started heating up, the church world couldn't stop talking. Let me tell you, this was no small disagreement. It became a storm that spread across pulpits, podcasts, and social media platforms. The moment Todd repeated his line about pastors building empires instead of disciples, people began dissecting every word. This is how the feud grew stronger, because with every clip that went viral, the speculation deepened. But here is the shocking part. Many younger pastors quietly admitted that Todd was saying what they had been thinking for years, but were too afraid to say. His voice wasn't just one voice anymore, it was starting to sound like a movement. Still, the backlash was equally fierce. Loyal supporters of Bishop Jakes came out in full defense. They reminded everyone of the decades Jakes had spent building not only a church, but community programs, outreach efforts, and mentorship for countless leaders. They argued that calling all of that an empire was unfair. This is where it gets interesting, because the criticism against Todd wasn't just about his words, it was about his attitude. Some accused him of arrogance, saying he was too young and too inexperienced to challenge a man who had carried the weight of ministry for more than 40 years. The craziest part was that instead of calming down, the feud only pulled in more voices, more opinions, and more fuel for the fire. What made this story different was that it wasn't just confined to the church anymore. Mainstream media outlets picked up on it, framing it as a generational clash between the old guard and the new wave of Christian leadership. Suddenly, the story wasn't just about sermons. It was about culture, money, and power. Todd was seen as the face of a digital-first church, while Jakes was the established mogul with influence stretching into politics and entertainment. And destiny took an unexpected turn when people began asking if this was more than just a clash. It might actually be the beginning of a generational handover in the church world. But here is the shocking part. Whispers inside church circles hinted that this might not just be about Todd versus Jakes. Some believe Todd's timing was intentional, coming at the exact moment Bishop Jakes was preparing to pass more responsibility to his daughter, Sarah Jakes Roberts. Sarah was already one of the most influential young pastors in America, drawing massive crowds and building her own empire through Women Evolve. Was Todd's boldness also a challenge to her rise? If so, then this wasn't just about two men, it was about the future dynasty of the Jakes family colliding with a rising digital force. This is where the story became much bigger than anyone expected, and the next steps could decide who would shape the future of modern Christianity. When Michael Todd's words refused to fade away and the debate grew louder, the real question became clear. What did this controversy mean for the future of the church? Let me tell you. This was no longer just about a fiery statement in one sermon. It had become a battle of legacy, influence, and direction. You won't believe how deeply people were divided. On one side stood the loyalists of Bishop T.D. Jakes, defending his decades of ministry, his community work, and his global influence. To them, Todd's remarks sounded like disrespect, almost like erasing all the sacrifices Jakes had made. On the other side, Todd's supporters cheered him on as a reformer, a man who dared to speak truth in a world where many stayed silent. This is how the lines were drawn, and no one could ignore the clash anymore. But here is the shocking part. Beyond the arguments and emotions, there were millions of dollars tied into both sides. T.D. Jakes' empire, built through books, films, conferences, and partnerships, had created a financial ecosystem that supported entire teams and organizations. Michael Todd, meanwhile, had turned Transformation Church into a digital powerhouse, with tens of millions flowing in after his viral rise. The craziest part was realizing that when Todd criticized empire building, he was also threatening financial structures that had taken decades to build. What made this story different? It was not just about theology. It was about money, power, and control over the loyalty of millions of believers. This is where it gets interesting. While Jakes represented tradition, structure, and legacy, Todd symbolized disruption, authenticity, and the digital age. One was rooted in history, the other in virality. And destiny took an unexpected turn when the controversy began shaping the bigger question. What kind of church would define the next 20 years? Would it be the legacy-driven, institution-focused model of Bishop Jakes and his family, with his daughter Sarah Jakes Roberts stepping into the spotlight? Or would it be the raw, internet-fueled movement led by voices like Michael Todd? That was the tension, and the answer would shape not just sermons, but culture itself. In the end, this wasn't just about Michael Todd versus T.D. Jakes. It was about the clash between the old guard and the new generation, between empire and authenticity, between legacy and disruption. And while Bishop Jakes stayed mostly silent, his silence spoke volumes. Would he defend his legacy directly? Or would he let his decades of work, his influence, and his daughter's rise answer for him? Meanwhile, Michael Todd's boldness had put him at a crossroads, either seen as a prophet of change or as a reckless challenger who went too far. One thing was certain: this feud had already forced the world to look at the church differently. And as people kept talking, one truth became clear: change was coming, whether the leaders wanted it or not.